there was to be an Arab state and a Jewish state, but really they thought that the Jordan River was the dividing line between the two.
The Jordan River.
But I think it is important that despite the Bevin and the British government thought that it was in their interests to work with the reality of United Nations support for a Jewish state at that point, Bevin was no fan of the prospect of a Jewish state, even if for reasons of realpolitik it was something that he had to go with. And at the same time, as Avi's already mentioned, that there's this profound distaste for the Palestinian Arab leadership. And I think that we have to acknowledge that there is a clear continuity from this point to the present day in the international community, including the British government, of an uneasiness with what they regard as non-mainstream Zionism. They're always looking for moderate Zionism, in other words, Zionism that will fit in with the international community's grand design, and also at the same time, quote-unquote, moderate Palestinians who will also fit in with the international community's grand design. And that takes us all the way back to the First World War.
When you say international community grand design, meaning what exactly?
I mean in the sense that in terms of the quartet.
So the Western sense driven.
Absolutely, but then again, that's a bit of a complicated element, because if we talk about the West, it doesn't really explain the entire membership of the quartet, does it? But I think that there is a mainstream sense within international politics that there is a search for moderate Zionists and moderate Palestinians, and that there's a way forward that isn't involve mutually exclusive nationalism on the parts of both parties. And I think that this is a misunderstanding of this war for statehood that goes back to the First World War.
And it's a joke, isn't it, that you get some Arabs who I think probably are motivated by the desire to flatter the British, saying, but you know us so well. What a joke. I mean, basically, the British weren't seeing anything, and it's not unlike the way the British ploughed in with the Americans into Iraq in 2003, and all sorts of things happened that they'd never anticipated. They really do not have that good a handle on the realities of the region.
I must go back to the Israeli narrative, the Zionist Israeli narrative on Palestine. So in the 1980s, there's a new history that was introduced, which says, look, there are no Palestinians. These are Arabs that immigrated in the end of the 19th century to Palestine. There is no such a thing as a Palestinian people, and the likes of John Peters onward, time of memorial and so on, advanced the idea that there needs to be a swap of refugees, Arab refugees back to the Arab world and Jewish refugees back into their homeland. What's wrong with this Israeli argument?
That
you don't know
Palestinians,
yes,
because it's such a completely unconvincing and implausible argument, because the Palestinians are refugees, and no one denies that. The debate is, why did they become refugees? The old historians said they left of their own accord. The new historians say they were pushed out. No one denies that there were refugees, and that there were 750,000 Palestinian refugees, more than half of the Palestinian population in Palestine. That's the biggest refugee problem and the most enduring refugee problem in post-war
So were they
history.
squeezed? Were they encouraged by their leaders to leave, as the Zionist narratives introduces, or is something else?
Benny Morris studied this question in very great depth and with the support of a mass of Israeli documentation. And his conclusion is that there were many reasons for the Palestinian exodus from Palestine, but the single most important, most central reason was Zionist military and psychological pressure. So by and large, most of the Palestinians were driven out, and therefore Israel created this refugee problem. Israel is responsible for this problem.
And the documentary evidence includes photographs obtained from the Israeli archives of the busing of Palestinians out of the areas in which they were living, of the separation of men and women, the organization of the population into camps to be bussed out or put in lorries out. There was an organization to the exodus. It didn't happen overnight, and it went on for months and months, over a year.
Before I go to what James talked about or called Palestinian mythology, I just want to finish up with the question of Israel. You mentioned the new historians and the new narrative introduced a revisionist history of sort. How much influence does that have in Israel?
During the few years after the Oslo Accord was signed in 1993, the Israeli public was quite receptive to the new perspectives. And
you mean because of the political environment?
Yes, because the Palestinians and the Israelis had embarked on the road to peace, and there was greater openness to the narrative of the other side, and new interpretations had some traction. History books for secondary schools were rewritten, not abandoning the old Zionist narrative, the version that I was taught at school in Israel, but opening up a debate about the causes of the Palestinian exodus. And Edward Said, who wasn't a historian, thought that the new history played quite an important part in Israeli politics in the decade after Oslo at three levels. He said that the new historians educated the Israeli public about their own history and about the relations with the Arabs. It also, to the Palestinians, it presented a version of history which wasn't just the propaganda of the victors. It was genuine history, honest history, which corresponded to their own experience of the Nakba. And thirdly, the new history created a climate of opinion on both sides of the divide, which was conducive to progress along the peace front.
James, history perceived or revisited within the constraints of ideological and the political situation of the day?
A great deal of the scholarship that's been published in recent years about the origins of the conflict and the evolution of the conflict. There's a willingness to accept and to emphasize, I think, quite clearly the significant role that was played by the British. But I think that in a lot of the historiography, there's still a tendency to go down either one path or another, that essentially, for example, with reference to the British, that they were either pro-Zionist or that they were anti-Palestinian.
But there is a new history that speaks more to the commonalities between Palestinians and Jews in the early part of the century than later perceived to be.
Well, it depends whether...
I mean, a common sociology of sort, if you will. There's an attempt to restudy Palestinian-Israeli relations, Palestinian-Jewish relations.
Well, Avi hasn't yet mentioned historians of Europe, like Shlomo Sand, who've questioned, have talked about the invention of the Jewish people. And there's a thesis out there that says that the Palestinians are also Jews. I mean, this can go on and on. What I would say in terms of the situation and its tragedy, because we have Palestinians either living outside historical Palestine as refugees or within the West Bank and Gaza as refugees and citizens, I beg your pardon, inhabitants of land under occupation. And if they are to have the rights, recognition of their rights as human beings and as the victims of a sequence or series of catastrophes, and to have representation, citizenship somewhere, if that is to happen, then it possibly is the case that the British could help by acknowledging that they have, take some of the heat, take some of the weight, and revisit their own history and say that there are a lot of people who, had they acted differently, could have prevented some of this spinning out the way it did.
Instead, we have Tony Blair now, the representative of the international community in Palestine.
All the parties to this conflict need to reassess the history in the light of new evidence. This is what the new historians have done, and I think this encouraged the emergence of new historians, and we have eminent new historians like Professor Rashid Khalidi of Columbia University. And Edward Said once wrote to me and asked me to organize a conference at Oxford on the moral and political consequences of 1948. For him, the moral consequences came before the political consequences. That's significant. The result was a conference we organized and a book that Eugene Rogan and I co-edited on the war for Palestine, rewriting the history of 1948. But to go back to an earlier discussion we had, history isn't written in a vacuum. History is written in a political context. And the emergence of the new history in the late 1980s owed very much to the aftermath of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, which was very controversial and aroused a great deal of criticism of the Israeli establishment. And that opened up a space for going further back to re-examine critically Israel's history. And similarly, as a result of the outbreak of the second Intifada in 2000, the Israeli minds have become closed again. There's been a reversal to fundamentalist positions, to us and them, to this notion that the Palestinians cannot be trusted, that the Oslo Accord was a mistake, and the whole of the Arab world is against us, and we must stand up and fight for ourselves.
But I guess we're back to ground zero, or point zero, as it were. Rosemary, gentlemen, we're going to have to end. Thank you for joining us. Until next time.